Hello, everybody. Welcome to the OneRing.net's look at Amazon's Lord of the Rings series. We are at a virtual WonderCon that is also owned by San Diego Comic-Con, and we are missing everybody while we're under quarantine orders. So we put together an awesome panel here to go through everything we know about Amazon's Lord of the Rings series, what the facts are, what the rumors are, what the anticipation is for fans. And overall, I think people are excited. And I am excited because we have an amazing group of people here to talk about this. Right next to me, I've got Mad Eye Gamgee. Jim Wirt is a longtime regular of our Dragon Con Tolkien track. I shouldn't say ours. It's just the Tolkien track, and it's been renamed in recent years, but Jim has been instrumental in organizing some of the scholarship panels and just the wonderful stuff that happens at Dragon Con supporting Middle Earth. And then we've got Garfin Mao. Kathy Garfin Mao is our events coordinator, our scheduler, our taskmaster, and our just an organizer of all things that require physical presence of people. And she helped gather everybody here. Abby is joining us from the Pacific Northwest. She's an actor, actress, producer, writer, multi-hyphenate, and she's been a regular at all of our One Ring events and has been a participant in some of our wonderful panels over the last couple of years, just giving a pulse of where fandom is right now. And of course, with his head in a book is Cliff Broadway, the host of Torn Tuesday and a longtime contributor to Green Books at the One Ring, producer of Ringers, Lord of the Fans, co-author of The People's Guide to J.R.R. Tolkien, and
one and two.
And Kathy was too. And this
no. 1 and 2 books 1 and 2.
Yeah, and there is so much to talk about. There's been so many announcements already, and let's just jump into it. So here is what we know so far. So Amazon has purchased the rights for the Lord of the Rings, the books, the appendices, and everything mentioned in the Lord of the Rings appendices for $250 million payment to the Tolkien estate. They cleaned up all the rights with all the other studios, including New Line, MGM, Saul Zaentz, and Warner Brothers. So this is their property now. We've heard upwards of a $3 billion production budget. Currently, 20 episodes are committed, with up to 5 season minimum, plus spin-offs are available to them. But 20 episodes are currently greenlit. They are targeting a 2021 release. They have full rights to Peter Jackson's creative. That means designs, orcs, goblins, effects, behind the scenes, stuff we didn't see, stuff we saw. The intent was to keep this show possibly in the same visual world. They are shooting in New Zealand right now, and it is based on the Age of Numenor and the Second Age. The other thing that happened is on the first couple weeks of production, there was a stunt injury, but Kathy just was telling us that the stunt woman is healing well now. What we don't know for sure is the full COVID-19 impact of production. We also don't know the plot focus or the details, but we will talk about that today on this panel. We also don't know if they've decided to move forward in PJ's world, Peter Jackson's world, but in earlier times, and how the new material bridges to those Third Age films. And then, of course, what is the full extent of the Tolkien estate's involvement in this? So who's in?
In other words, if you were looking at this from the perspective of a Star Trek fan, who is the Gene Roddenberry who's running the engine? If you were a Game of Thrones fan, the analogy would be, who is the David Benioff or D.B. Weiss? And here is our answer for all Lord of the Rings fans. Here is your analogy. We have the Wunderkinds, Patrick McKay and Mr. J.D. Payne, these gentlemen who were well known throughout all of Hollywood for having one of the hottest, yet to be produced, scripts that they had written for Paramount. I believe it was a Star Trek feature, was it not,
Yeah.
Justin?
Yes, it was a Star Trek feature that never got produced.
Yes.
But it got them on the blacklist, right?
Exactly. And that blacklist, is a reference to that hot list that is going around Hollywood of all the best screenplays that are really, really popular, that all the studios are talking about and buzzing about, with the head agencies also talking about it. But for one reason or another, those are the scripts that are floating in production limbo without actually being picked up yet.
So they are basically Amazon's Benioff and Weiss, a couple unproven writer producers that have never made anything but have a vision and sold it to the studio as such, and they have the full trust.
I think they're connected to Jungle Cruise, this new thing that's coming out from Disney.
Ooh, that looked good. That looked really good. All right, if they're the showrunners, who did they hire to direct? J.A. Bayona is the first director to touch Middle Earth since Peter Jackson started over 20 years ago. And we have a quote from Bayona. J.R.R. Tolkien created one of the most extraordinary and inspiring stories of all time. And as a lifelong fan, it is an honor and a joy to join this amazing team. Where have we seen him before, Cliff?
He is the director of A Monster Calls, most recently. That's the most memorable picture that
Did he also do
comes to mind.
Jurassic World 2?
Yes, that's right. And he also directed this tsunami disaster film that starred Naomi Watts and also Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ewan McGregor.
That was fabulous. That was fabulous.
We highly recommend checking out A Monster Calls. It touches on, it's not the movie you think it is, and it touches on many of the themes common in Tolkien's stories. And so when they announced J.A. Bayona would be directing the pilot episode, and which sets the tone and the visual language for the entire series going forward, there's nothing but support for this. He's got the right resume. He's got the right passion. He's just has the right sensibility, especially for the second age, which we're going to explain why in just a second. In the writer's room, we've got two of the biggest names in television right now. There's a whole writer's room, but it's being led by Brian Cogman from Game of Thrones, Jennifer Hutchinson from Breaking Bad, and Better Call Saul. These are two of the most respected television writers now, of this generation right now. If you talk to any Game of Thrones fans, no matter what season they loved and what episodes they love, there is almost universal praise for Brian Cogman. And Amazon is lucky to have someone who has just come off of Game of Thrones to help consult and inform a smooth production on this. And of course, Jennifer Hutchinson, follow her on Twitter. She's amazing. She's very generous with her information and her support. And if you look her up on IMDb, you will be comforted by her resume.
Yeah,
She's
Better
the
Call
right
Saul.
person to lead this.
Real quick, I just wanted to go back to Bayona's directing that tsunami film is called The Impossible. And I just wanted to highlight it because it really was a phenomenal film with lots of effects, obviously, of walls of water and the debris that goes on for miles and miles after those the tsunamis 10 years ago.
You really want to see Numenor sink, don't you?
I really do want to see Numenor sink, and I know he can do it.
No, hey, if you guys want to take a good read on Brian Cogman, and all the fans should be aware of how he came to be who he was on the Game of Thrones production, I refer you back to the Vanity Fair piece that was written in 2019 during last year. Check that out. It's a great profile of Mr. Cogman and what he contributed to Game of Thrones success, especially from a geek point of view.
Yes. Now, Jim, what are these writers writing about?
Yeah. So we thought we would dive a little bit into a quick history of the Second Age.
Now,
One of the
spoilers,
things,
everybody.
yeah, spoiler
If you
alert.
don't want to know anything about this TV series, move along. But these books have been published for over 30 years, 40 years, upwards of 70 years. So, you know, we just want to put it out there.
But it is kind of spoilers, but there's not a lot of spoilers because unlike Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, all we have about the Second Age, we actually have appendices that are at the back of the Return of the King, and it's basically just a chronology. Or there's some that are written in some of the history of Middle-earth, things that came out later that Christopher Tolkien was the editor on. But we don't really have a lot of narrative. What we have are tent poles, events. And my understanding is that Amazon cannot mess with the basic outlines, but there's a lot of areas where they have room to maneuver with characters, with stories and story arcs. But here's what we know. The Second Age, the whole story of the Lord of the Rings was basically a year long. But the story of the Second Age is 3,441 years long. And so
wow.
And throughout all that period, we're going to see lots of things that are going to get set up that we have references for in the Lord of the Rings. But the whole Second Age is defined first by basically the destruction of a lot of Western Middle-earth as we knew it, and the downfall of this guy, the banishment of a character named Morgoth, who was the predecessor for Sauron. And from that, we start to see things begin to happen. So for example, the Grey Havens get set up, which we saw Frodo and company sail away from. The island of Numenor is established, and that's going to be one of the guiding things through the whole Second Age is the kingdom that occurs and is established in Numenor, and all of the political machinations and all of the temptations and all of what ultimately becomes the great downfall of that island. At the same time, back in Middle-earth, you have things like Moria and the kingdom of the dwarves are first established. You have especially this next one, which is the arising of Sauron. He was around in the First Age and was a servant of Morgoth, but in many ways, this whole story in part is the story of the rise and ultimately in the fall, at least for a while, of Sauron.
This is what makes it most interesting, I think, to a lot of fans. Like, if you're going to do a dark television series,
right?
It's about Sauron. How does he corrupt all the races of men and elves and dwarves?
So if you have a storyline that's 3,441 years old, you obviously need to have some characters, presumably, that are going to continue across even that whole timeline. And Sauron is certainly one of those. In contrast, we have the men of Numenor, who are going to see probably lots of lineage, some of which are even linked back to people that we do know, like Elrond, because his brother Elros was the guy that founded Numenor back there in 32.
Wait, so Elrond is existing? He lives right now?
Yeah, Elrond was born before the Second Age, and his brother Elrond decides to stay an elf. Elros, his brother, decides to become human. They're half elven, so they get the choice. And Elrond continues. Elros actually dies early in the Second Age. And so if you want to think about the antagonists and protagonists throughout this entire Second Age, probably these are going to be good candidates. Galadriel and Celeborn for the good, Sauron for the bad. And then here's a big event. Around 1600, about halfway through the Second Age, Sauron forges the Rings of Power. About the same time, Celebrimbor also forges, apart from Sauron, the 3 Elven Rings. So about 1600, you get the introduction of the whole ring theme. And that is obviously going to probably propel a lot of other interesting storylines, like how the Nazgul get consumed. Meanwhile, Elrond founds Rivendell around 1700 on the timeline. And about that time, what is happening throughout is a huge ongoing war between the elves and Sauron. And it appears that the elves are about to be overwhelmed until the Númenóreans show up, because they ask for help, and the Númenórean army arrives on the shore of Middle-earth, not as colonizers, but as reinforcements to the nearly defeated elves. And their arrival is overwhelmingly positive in this battle, one of which is called the Battle of Gwathlo, I'm assuming is how it's pronounced, which in turn ends up driving Sauron back in great defeat to lick his wounds back as he hunkers down in Mordor, actually. The ring wraiths have by now become corrupted by their rings of power, so they arise and become lieutenants for Sauron. But ultimately, and so there's like a 1,000-year gap here between 2251 and 3255, where you get the arisal of the ultimate Númenórean king. In fact, he's the last Númenórean king, a guy named called Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. It will be interesting to see if and how Amazon casts this role.
I was just thinking the same thing. Who is going to be the choice actor who gets that plum role? Wow.
Exactly. Pharazôn is the pinnacle of Númenórean culture, the pinnacle of Númenórean power, the pinnacle of a navy, the pinnacle of an army, the pinnacle of arrogance, all contained in this one character. And he jumps into this battle between the elves and men, and ultimately Sauron is captured or defeated in 3262. I think that's the next picture. Ar-Pharazôn and his army arrive, and it'll be interesting to see how they play this, because in reality, it might be that Sauron wants to be captured. This is part of his strategy, because in his arrogance, similar to what Isildur did with the ring, Sauron has left his ring back at Barad-dûr, and he is captured and taken back to Númenor by Ar-Pharazôn, at which point he becomes Sauron the Seducer. He's not named Sauron. We'll have to see how Amazon names him. But Sauron becomes the high priest of Melkor, the early name for Morgoth, and seduces all of the leaders and of the Númenóreans, except for a few. People like Isildur and his sons are not swayed by Sauron. Sauron builds a temple, which has never been built before, on the top of the biggest mountain, Menel Tarma, in Númenor, and proceeds to convince Ar-Pharazôn that he should have eternal life, just like all those elves. And all he needs to do is build a big enough armada and sail westward to Valinor, or Aman, to claim his rights. And that's what he does. So Ar-Pharazôn builds this vast armada. He sails toward Númenor, at which point Eru Ilúvatar and the Valar decide enough is enough. And we get finally the scene where Númenor is overwhelmed. It's Tolkien's Atlantis scene. And so that could be epic in terms of how the tension running up to that scene happens, and then the whole, the sinking of Númenor and the escape of the faithful few Númenóreans who make their way with a few heirlooms of Númenor, and finally are able to land back on the shores of Middle-earth.
Does the fall of Númenor make sense as the beginning of Amazon series, as an iconic first season thing, or does it make sense to?
I think there's way too much that has to happen. I mean, the fact that
you
Amazon,
have to have the forging of the rings, at least.
Well, the fact that they published the map of Númenor, it would not make sense to me that they would start by sinking that thing on the map.
So is this like the end of 5 seasons? Like this is?
Who knows?
Maybe the end of 4 seasons, with the 5th season being the Gondor and Arnor. being developed.
Well,
Perhaps.
and racing to the end of the Third Age. That's what happens. So Isildur lands with his sons Anarion, or Elendil lands with his sons Isildur and Anarion. They form the kingdoms of Gondor in the south, Arnor in the north, and they again align with the elves for the War of the Last Alliance, and attack ultimately north. So this is where we get the Dead Marshes and the Field of Dagorlad, and ultimately the very first scene that we see in the Fellowship of the Ring happens at the very end of the Second Age, and when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's hand and he collapses and disintegrates and goes wherever he goes until he arrives again, and we have the Lord of the Rings appear. That's the end of the Second Age. Sauron's defeated, the One Ring is claimed, the Second Age is over, and now we can start the Lord of the Rings.
So there's a short amount of time between the fall of Numenor and Sauron defeated. I mean, things are just happening at a brisk pace. So if this show is meant to lead up into what Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and that epic introduction, probably one of the best movie intros of all time, it makes sense that the fall of Numenor is the end of the series. And
perhaps it is no coincidence that the Elvish word for Numenor is Atalante, and that is maybe just Tolkien's idea of a linguistic playfulness, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
So Kathy and Abby, we've got some awesome characters to deal with. I think Jim just touched on a few, but some of these are familiar and some of them aren't to me.
Well, I love the fact that we might get a Gil-galad.
Yeah.
And Celebrimbor, you can't have the Forging of the Rings without him.
Yeah. I mean, Galadriel too. Like, I'm just, we need more strong female characters. So I'm super excited to see her involved.
Does it make sense to have this tentpole series with Galadriel as the lead character?
I mean, yeah. You know, she's kind of one of the moving forces in the later series. So having her be the pinnacle character in this, it could be really important. Besides the fact that, like, if you want to introduce more representation and diversity in general, I mean, the one thing that I love is that that's literally where most productions are going, and I am so here for it. You're already gonna have a fan base, but why not be able to reach out to like other people, who are like, oh, okay, well, this is not about a bunch of men going off into the unknown to search for power. Why not have this angelic being be a driving force on all of the events that typically happen. So I'm definitely excited to see what they do with her, especially because there's so much more. She's so much more than what she was given in the movies. So I'm really excited to see, like, how they actually develop her character and who she is and how she is, because she's such an important person.
Well, I also like really having the idea of seeing possibly Elrond and Elros, to see the brothers and to see that decision of, I'll take an elven life, I'll take a human life, or be human. And to see that division and
why they were motivated to do it.
And also
exactly
the mortality aspect of that too. If you are choosing to be human, you do have to realize that there's a mortality issue with that, and you are not going to be around to see so many different things like most of the other elves that are involved in the stories.
Which is one of Tolkien's big themes, which is they're going to have to. I mean, why choose to die?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it was motivating our Farazan to attack Valinor as well.
Yeah, exactly. In the opposite direction. Yeah.
Do you think this show would benefit from showing Galadriel before she has married Celeborn? Is there any value in showing a young Galadriel, making choices?
Well, they'd have to go back to the first age.
Yeah.
Is there room? Is there room for? Is there room to have that discussion in the show? I mean, you know, this show is not. The writers and the creators can play with time frames and timelines like that, and this is something I think that they have the rights to explore if they wanted to.
Galadriel is such a fascinating character. In fact,
Yeah.
in Tolkien's writings, he changed her story a lot along the way.
Yeah.
And so I think she's very sympathetic.
I also like the fact that her character, because of where she came from before they landed in Middle Earth, and the situations that were going on amongst some of the wars, basically banished her from being able to go to Valinor. And it was her actions in Middle Earth that basically, particularly giving up of the ring, that finally, you know, earned her the right to be able to sail west.
Mm-hmm.
And in her thing, she was never actually battling against. She was always trying to assist, trying to help. What would be seen the moral high ground. And so I think this, no matter what characters we're dealing with, is the moral courage of respecting other races, respecting life, and who does and who does not. And because obviously with Sauron / Anatar / whatever he's going to be calling himself throughout the series, he tends to be on the opposite side of that. So any one of these elves are on the balancing side.
Yeah.
And to see that, you know, whether it's I take a mortal life or I take an eternal life, any of these things, it's always going to come down to moral judgment. And I think that's one of Tolkien's biggest things is the moral courage to do the right thing, even when it's hard or it might cause your death.
It's an interesting thing. It relates to power as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, the background and the texture we may see about Galadriel will potentially bring so much to the scene that we have seen where she says, you know, in place of the Dark Lord, you would have a queen.
Yeah.
And we can see all the choices and the temptations that led up to that huge temptation and her refusal to submit to it. When we finally see her.
As we look at some more of the characters that are we know about that are in the text written by Tolkien, again, it's you know, the name Elendil and Isildur are familiar. Jim, you were just talking about Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. There aren't a lot of female characters.
Actually, there are. This. What you'd have to do is you have to dive into that a bunch of R's and Tars under there. The only story actually that we have of the Second Age is one of a woman. Let me find her name. Her name is Arendis, and it's a story of how she gets married off and is persecuted and how she overcomes that. Interestingly, there are at least, I think, 3 or maybe 4 of the list of Númenórean royalty who are queens and not kings. And so if in fact Amazon lingers at the more of that whole line and how Númenor develops, it's quite possible that we will see other strong women that will come forward. We just, you know, nobody knows their names unless you like to read the genealogies of Númenor.
And probably the
hobbits love to read genealogy. Let's just put a hobbit on this track. The hobbit will come back and tell us because that's their thing.
And the most familiar characters besides Galadriel and Elrond will probably be Sauron and the Witch King of Angmar and the Nazgul. And this series is expected to show the corruption of those kings.
By Magic Mike stylings of Sauron, only at theonering.net, ladies and gentlemen.
Who do we know? Who do we know is in the cast? That this is your new Lord of the Rings cast. Look at their faces, get to know their names. These are the people that Amazon wants you to fall in love with all over again as the cast of Middle Earth in the Second Age of Númenor.
Yeah.
Let's go through some of them.
Raise your hand. How many of you cast members are Numenorians? Because I don't smell any dwarves in the room. This looks like a distinctly Elvish and Numenorian cast. But let's see.
Yes. So that, that's the first thing, book purists will say that they don't need to recast Galadriel and Elrond. They can use the same actors because by the Second Age, they will have still looked the same and grown up. So once you get past that and allow the creative and storytelling license that Amazon has and should have, having a younger Galadriel, this looks perfect casting. Morphin Clark.
Yeah.
And so we've got Joseph Mall, who was in Game of Thrones, and he's been in several other shows. They've called his character Oren, Oren.
Okay.
There's some
We're not
speculation.
entirely sure these names are real.
Yeah, and there's speculation that he is the bad guy. So maybe he is sexy Sauron.
I mean, he looks like a bad guy.
I'm okay with that, Sauron.
Ben in Game of Thrones,
I'm okay with that, Sauron.
Yeah, I think so too.
Although I kind of feel that he would make a perfect king who's being corrupted, but that's just me.
Now, Markella Kavanagh has been listed as a character named Tyra.
Yeah, she was the first one introduced.
She was the first one announced as cast. She looks pretty young. Are there any characters that we know of from Tolkien's scriptures that speak of a character her age?
I don't know.
No, if they're using a name like Tyra, which may or may not be a code word, then we're totally in the realm of new characters being made up from whole cloth.
Yeah.
Did Galadriel ever have children or sisters?
Well, she had children.
Well, how do we get to Arwen without Arwen's? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, she had Celebrian, who was Elrond's wife, who was
correct.
Emma Horvath has been in a bunch of horror films. She's a horror actress, and I think she worked on some movies that were produced by J.A. Bayona. And Cliff, there's a few actors in here that come from the horror film industry, and it feels very familiar because that's where Peter Jackson kind of played in.
And also, Mr. Bayona is experienced, a veteran of the Penny Dreadful series.
That's right.
So, and it's not the first time that we've seen somebody go from, The Frighteners, which is comedy horror played at a fun level, and then go straight into big and bright, a romantic adventure like The Lord of the Rings. And it was just, it was possible. We didn't have much faith at the time that Peter Jackson was going to pull that rabbit out of the hat.
But he also did Heavenly Creatures.
Indeed.
Which was beautiful and won him an Oscar or an Oscar nomination. So
yes, and he discovered Kate
Winslet.
Kate Winslet, indeed.
That's right. Yeah. We've got Ismael Cruz Cordova. He's a Puerto Rican actor who's been on a bunch of TV shows. Ray Donovan, Berlin Station with, I believe, Richard Armitage is in that show.
Yes.
And this was a curious announcement because, Peter Jackson's films, let's just call them the New Line Cinema Lord of the Rings films, rightfully received some flack for only casting the Maori actors in orc roles. Mm-hmm. And it was, a product of the time. It was made over 20 years ago. And it's got to be top of mind now for filmmakers to have a more diverse cast and not just throw, all Maori looking people under orc prosthetics. So this, having Ishmael in a feature role is encouraging and starts to resolve some of those early. You remember some of the conversations that people were having online, Abby, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a situation of making sure that you're obviously staying within the world, but the nice thing is that you can literally explore so many different ethnicities when it comes to this story. So and I've seen him in the Mandalorian too. So I mean, why not diversify your cast as much as possible?
Well, particularly if you're going to end up showing the possibility of showing the Numenorians colonizing and going out. They're now going to be exploring parts of Middle Earth that are on the fringes of the maps we've seen before. Mm-hmm. And before, or maybe because of Sauron's wanting to get involved in tampering with those people, and of course he's got to find the human king somewhere, right? Yeah. So he's probably going to be all over the planets, but you're going to be able to encounter all of these cultures when they were just people who were farming and building their houses and raising families and stuff like that before any of them became allies or enemies of Sauron or anyone else in the world.
The interesting thing about, we just saw Tom Budge, who's an Australian actor, but one of my most favorite castings so far is Nazanin Boniadi. She's an Iranian actress. She's fluent in multiple languages. She was seen in Hotel Mumbai. She's very politically active.
But Homeland.
And Homeland. And she, if you start to think about how important linguistics are to Tolkien's worlds, her casting makes me excited that they are intentionally looking for actors that are multilingual. What's the linguistic nature of Numenor?
Well, hey, the Numenorian language, and it was called Adunaic. Is that correct, Jim?
I think so, yeah. And
it is going to be an opportunity for all the hardcore Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion are academics to really go toe-to-toe into whatever surviving manuscripts there are that Tolkien has, which are probably precious few, about where Adunaic really is as far as what they call a conlang, a constructed language. And his work on Quenya and Sindarin and is far more involved in terms of developed grammar and vocabulary and idiosyncrasies of the languages. Adunaic may not be as greatly developed as many of the other invented languages that Tolkien worked on. So it might be another, quote unquote, possible spot for creativity.
Sophia Noviti is.
I was just going to tack on real quick. There will also be Quenya, because when Elendil arrives back in Middle Earth, he makes a Quenyan pronouncement, which we've seen before, because it's exactly what Aragorn sings when he's crowned the king.
Yes, indeed. That's exactly right.
We'll get some interesting intermix going on there.
Excellent. And then Sophia is another Iranian African actress. She's based in the UK. She does a lot of stage work and a lot of Broadway work. She's very, very respected in the stage community in London, and I'm excited that she's involved. And then she
also has like a very different body type from what you're used to seeing. So I'm super excited that they casted, first of all, a plus size woman, on top of the fact that she is a darker skin tone. So I'm wondering who exactly she's supposed to be playing, because this is like
knowing which continent we're on.
Yeah, like she's a totally different side of the spectrum.
So there's 3 Iranian actors and actresses already cast officially on the show. Cliff, you and I have talked about Tolkien basing some of his mythologies, some of his stories on Eastern Mediterranean mythologies. So the question is it true to Tolkien to be casting such actors?
Why not? Absolutely. Look, we have so many areas of the world that the Numenorians explore. They bring great advancements in, tools to take people from the, from the Iron Age up into the Bronze Age, basically up to the, perhaps that was a bad analogy and I said that wrong, but there's going to be areas of the planet that are people that Sauron wants to have allegiances with, and people that the Númenóreans are going to meet and trade, and they're going to teach them about agriculture and irrigation and using better tools and equipment. And so all this stuff is going to happen in the Second Age if we're, making an assumption about where in this thousands and thousands of years Amazon is going to land us on season 1, episode 1, where the main narrative will be in this great timeline. But yeah, let us explore, let us meet all of the different peoples of this planet and look at what weird machinations Sauron is going to contrive to try to seduce these people one way or another when the Númenórean influence becomes apparent.
Well, and I was just going to say, it makes sense that it makes sense that he would have brought in some of the Persian culture. The Persian culture has medical and writing and poetry and artwork that dates back thousands of years in our world. And so to bring a similar culture somewhere else on the planet that has more advanced culture than just the Númenóreans. The Númenóreans can't be the only ones, and everyone else is running around in the Iron Age. And so to have another culture that possibly has independently advanced is kind of a nice possibility.
Yeah. The Númenóreans won't be necessarily monolithic either. There's a whole cast of antagonistic Númenóreans. We talked about the colonization thing, because there's a whole cast that goes in the southern sections of the map. Tolkien calls them the Black Númenóreans. I don't think that's necessarily a race-related thing as much as it is a heart-related idea.
Well, let's hope not.
But the potential for even exploring different interactions and political machinations within Númenor is quite high as well.
And then rounding out the cast as we've been cycling through, Robert Aramayo from Game of Thrones has just joined the cast. He is expected to be playing young Elrond. And there's something wonderfully circular about Robert Aramayo joining Amazon's Lord of the Rings, because in Game of Thrones, he played young Ned Stark, who was Sean Bean's character in the first season of Game of Thrones. So this is young Sean Bean joining Lord of the Rings. Boromir's lineage is not expected to be a part of this.
No, let's not go with fantasy type of storylines here.
Well, let's talk about some of those expectations. Can this thing even live up to, anything? So what is the pulse of fandom right now? Cliff, do you think fandom is ready for a new take on Middle-earth?
Yes, definitely. There's more than enough appetite for Middle-earth to be, recreated and explored. The video games have had, different levels of success. The fandom wants to be enfranchised a little more and be involved more and have some a level of communication with these wonderful people who are endeavoring to take on our most beloved author. It's a very exciting time, but also a time of a heightened anxiety, maybe.
Yeah, Abby, PJ kind of told his story. So do you think everybody's ready for a new story?
It's been a while since the movies have come out. We just celebrated over 20 years of Lord of the Rings, and so I feel like we're at a point now where we're looking for new content, obviously. So diving into this world, I feel a lot of people are really, really excited. Like, I've been seeing a lot of real wonderment involved in the story and the storyline, and even friends who I didn't think were too into Tolkien or anything have been posting and sharing about filming going on and some of the casting that they've seen. I mean, there's a huge cosplay group out here in like the Portland and just the Pacific Northwest area that does, that gets a chance to go out to the filmings, well, not the filmings, but like the premieres, the movie premieres, or that went to the premieres. Like there's a massive collective costuming, like literal Lord of the Rings costuming group.
Oh yeah, there's lots of those.
Yeah, that I'm a part of, and I've just seen nothing but like really great comments, in regards to that. But there's always the other side of it too, where you've seen a lot of negativity that's been involved. So I definitely know that there's a market for it right now. I feel like people just want to make sure that it's done right, because when Hollywood gets their fingertips in something, you always have to worry. So
that's right.
People are excited about this. I from what I've heard, people seem to be really excited about this.
And when we say doing it right, budget is only part of the equation.
Absolutely.
And Jeff Bezos committing $1 billion, maybe even $3 billion, is just part of it, because to do it right requires great writing, great directing, great acting, and a great relationship with fans that are really become the fourth estate of franchise filmmaking. Now, Kathy, to that point, Peter Jackson kind of spoiled us and brought us along for the journey with his appendices. But we're in a world now where there's no DVDs anymore, and there's no bonus features to be had on DVDs. So there's an opportunity here to have kind of production diaries while they're making it. But I think you had a story about what really turned you positive on Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, when it comes to the Lord of the Rings films, I can remember being cautiously optimistic. I was really excited about a film coming out, but being kind of reticent to really jump on the bandwagon because they could do horrible things to it and then turn you off the books, or turn, like turn off the DVD. Don't go to the movie, go pull out my books and sit down with my hot chocolate and read.
That's where we're all at right now.
So that's where we're all at right now. And it took Richard Taylor appearing on the OneRing.net's panel at Comic-Con in 2001. He was only on stage for maybe 10 minutes. And when he talked about their love of Tolkien, and their commitment and how much time and effort, I mean, he was the first one to talk about the guys making the chainmail, and they were losing their fingerprints because they were working so much with those little rings and stuff like that. When they started talking about that kind of commitment, 10 minutes in, and I was like, okay, I'm a cheerleader now. I'm going to go out and cheer for this. I'm going to host line parties. I ended up joining the OneRing.net and planning Oscar parties and all sorts of stuff. But it took Richard Taylor, who was the head of Weta at the time, to talk about their commitment, the filmmakers' commitments to the material and the work, and their commitment to the fans and what the fans were expecting. It took that to pull me in. I mean,
you were in for the longest relationship you've ever had.
Yeah, the trailers were great, but it took that to really do it.
Yeah.
And then Jim, I think top of mind for Amazon is what Fandom has turned into in recent years with Star Wars, with Game of Thrones after season 7 and 8. Fandom doesn't really have the strongest of reputations now, but this is different.
It is. In some ways, it goes back to what Abby was talking about too, in terms of the attractiveness. The disadvantage we have right now is that, unlike Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which are incredibly broad in their appeal, and you can find Tolkien societies almost everywhere in the world, crossing cultures, crossing
Yeah.
ages. You know, it's an unbelievably extensive, rich fandom. And it's all motivated by this story, which is so meaningful. I mean, right now in the middle of a COVID crisis, it's almost therapeutic to watch the 20-year-old movies that have held up so well because they
Or
resonate.
the party.
That's right. So whether it's we're partying with hobbits, or we're seeing the lighting of the beacons and hope rekindled, or we're charging with the Rohirrim, you know, it just resonates with us. Now, what we don't have as much in the Second Age stories is the richness of all of those character arcs and dialogue and stories. What we have, like we went through at the beginning, was a bunch of tent poles. And the genius for me of Jackson was he treated the Lord of the Rings like history, which is why you are losing your fingerprints doing authentic armor and putting, you know, all the details and scenes that we never saw unless it was in the appendices. So if Amazon is able to capture that spirit of Tolkien, because, you know, Tolkien tried to get the Silmarillion published first because it was so central. Its fabric was leading into the kinds of stories that you were going to read. So if we can retain that fabric, this will be globally popular, I think, because the stories and the issues, death, how we deal with power, where there is hope, the ideas of redemption, all those kinds of themes that are so important to us. If we can retain that spirit of Tolkien, versus, you know, what some of us felt happened with the last couple seasons of, say, Game of Thrones, then I think we have
yes,
a real opportunity.
Said it.
So I'm hopeful, but, you know, I'm not without my concerns.
Well, Cliff, you know, the biggest question is, the overall question, which is, did Tolkien want these spin-offs? Did he ever intend, you know, further exploration of Middle Earth? Because we are beyond, you know, as Jim just said, we are beyond the stories that he wrote. We have totems that we can build off of, and we've got this quote that keeps getting passed around, where, you know, Tolkien himself wrote in a letter that he leaves a scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. So is this show true to Tolkien?
He thought of that as an early, naive, maybe he, you know, reflected upon it as he wrote in that very same letter and said, I did have a mind to cast this into a bigger canvas that other people could participate and come and play in the creative sandbox.
So as we're wrapping up the panel, let's get some final thoughts on the show. Are you excited? What are you most excited for, and what are you most nervous about? Kathy, let's start with you.
Well, I think we've mentioned it a couple times. I am excited to see not just the fall of Numenor, but what leads to it. You know, the tensions going on in Numenor between the elves and between the Numenorians, as well as the Numenorian and Anatar / Sauron. But for an action piece, yeah, I'd kind of like to see Numenor fall. What I'm most nervous about is simply, since they have to fill in so many gaps, they've got these 10 poles, but they have a lot of gaps to fill in, is that they should keep asking themselves, what would Tolkien write if he was expanding this story? Just, you know, that spirit of Tolkien, what message was he trying to say? Even though these are vague outlines, what was he trying to say? How was he trying to say it? So that you keep that spirit of Tolkien even when you are creating the in-between spaces.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll answer two ways. One, I'm most excited as far as the production. I always get excited by characters. And whether that's to have a chance to see some characters unpacked, so we talked about Galadriel, who knows? I mean, Gandalf or Aloran was present in the First Age, and if he happens to show up in Numenor a little bit, I would say hoorah to that. So or our Farazan or Elros, you know, and Elrond interactions would be terrific. What am I worried about? I'm worried about fidelity. I think that there is a lot of room to play, and my concern is around trying to do the cable thing to Tolkien. And I don't want that. I don't want to see that happen. The other way to answer it is I am really excited about a whole new series of collectibles. So if they come out with the Scepter of Numinos, man, my money. And I'm worried
now
about
you're talking.
I'm worried
One of
about
the
my
real
bank
crowns,
account.
one of the
That's what
real
I'm worried about.
crowns. You know, the white tree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's what I'm worried about too, my bank account.
Abby.
Well, for me, I think, you know, Kathy knows a lot about this, especially because of my tirade about Tolkien on one of my other shows. I mean, the main reason why I even got into filmmaking was, and even sensitivity writing, was the fact that I was so sick and tired of seeing fantasy-based stories that did not represent me, that did not represent other people, you know, of color that I knew. And with this world, they literally have the opportunity to play in so many different worlds and ethnic backgrounds. And you know, I want to feel like the reason why I'm watching this is because you know, it has some way, it represents me in some way. Trying to find like characters to cosplay, you know, it was really really, it's hard right now, especially. You know, the best I can come up with is an orc, and I'm sorry, but that's a lot of makeup, okay? So, you know, seeing what they do with the new stories, seeing what they do with the characters, and trying to stay as true as possible to the books. You know, I'm just hoping that they can explore a lot more worlds than, you know, what they have, and do it well and not stereotypical.
Yes, definitely.
Cliff.
Oh, I want to agree with Abby 100,000%, because there's a moment when Faramir in Peter Jackson's movie looks down at the fallen body of this young man, who is obviously one of those Maori young actors who was cast for the role.
Yeah.
And there's just such an incredibly introspective and really transcendent moment where Faramir regards this person, this enemy of Gondor, in a different way, and thinks what lies and deceits were told to him to make him come so far away from the safety of home and the comfort of home, which is actually a rather Bilbo point of view for Faramir to take at that moment in time. But it's really awesome now that the Second Age of Middle-earth allows us to meet and understand all of these civilizations, and lets us have more of a reason to hate Sauron, who comes along and messes with these people and corrupts them or deceives them into service with him. And it gives us so much more of a reason to be tightly knit into the existing story of Sauron and how deceptive and awful he is. And for us to have, as a viewership, to have relationships with all these different people in Middle-earth is going to be so awesome and fit right into the broader, strange things of that happen in the greater timeline, which they have to contractually hit all those big battles. I mean, more than anything, I want to see Galadriel have a relationship with all the friendly dwarves in Moria when they're at a time of great bustling trade and friendship between the elves of Eregion and Celebrimbor. And you know, keep in mind that Galadriel is one of those Noldorin elves who is a descendant of Fëanor. And she had strong relationships with the dwarven craftsmen, and she respected their work. And imagine all the great times, because that will give further credence to that moment where, you know, Gimli and Legolas actually do come together in remembrance of the echoes of this Second Age relationship between the dwarves of Moria and the elves. It's going to be such a fertile ground. I'm excited about so much of it, and equally with Jim's sentiment, I'm nervous as hell sometimes, because if the fidelity to Tolkien is not there, then there's no amount of messing around in the sandbox that will make it work. unless they happen to get into that rarefied air of what Professor Tolkien did. And that was keep it thematically pure. And it's just, it's a really big task. They got big shoes to fill.
Well, we're out of time. I appreciate everybody joining the panel. Jim, Abby, Kathy, Cliff, all in different time zones, all in different states, coming together under quarantine rules. This has been the OneRing.net's look at the Amazon Lord of the Rings series as we know it during quarantine 2020. You can follow us on all the socials at the OneRing.net, one word. And if you go to the main website, theonering.net, that's where you can find everybody. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, WonderCon, for making this available to fans and keeping us all connected through our geek community. And we will see you at the tail end of all of this.